40 years ago, a woman named Daisy Moore vanished on the familiar stretch of road between the Wheeling industrial area, disappearing without a trace and leaving her family plunged into panic. Authorities suspected two coworkers who had previously clashed with Daisy, but with no body, insufficient physical evidence, and the investigation quickly stalled. It dragged on for decades. Yet throughout those years, the investigators who refused to give up clung tightly to the hope that the truth lay somewhere in the forgotten evidence. Then one day, while reopening old case files and examining a piece of evidence that had seemed utterly worthless, they discovered a detail everyone had previously overlooked, a detail powerful enough to change the entire case and leave the community stunned. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching this video from, and if you enjoy this content, don't forget to hit subscribe to support the channel. One late fall afternoon blanketed the Wheeling industrial area in a light, cold mist, the pale gray sky hanging over the weathered tin roofs, and the steady clanging of metal echoed from the workshops across the road like the familiar heartbeat of the area. The damp air rising from Wheeling Creek filled the small slope in front of the equipment storage gate with a hazy vapor, making everything feel as if it were moving in slow motion. Daisy Moore, 35 years old, finished her shift and left the storage facility with her crossbody canvas bag, her steps calm and steady, showing no sign of haste or fatigue after a long day. People near the area described seeing Daisy appear in the soft yellow glow of the streetlights that had just come on early, her shadow stretching long across the slightly damp concrete like a dark streak chasing each footstep. A neighbor walking his dog along the back corridor behind the industrial park saw Daisy pass by the row of trees along the side road. He clearly remembered a sudden gust of wind blowing her hair lightly to one side, while her bag swayed gently with the rhythm of her body. A man standing nearby noticed Daisy pause at a small intersection, tilting her head toward the warehouse area as if thinking or weighing something. Daisy's gesture showed no panic or confusion. It was more like the moment someone reconsiders their direction before continuing. After standing still for a few seconds, she kept walking toward the row of trees, where the streetlight faded and the space grew darker because the concrete wall of the factory blocked much of the light. Her figure grew smaller in view, then disappeared around the bend leading down the low slope. That was the last time anyone saw Daisy in this area. When the sunset faded completely and the sky turned deep blue, her family still believed Daisy would come home as usual. The small house where she lived was always lit up at this hour, but today everything was unusually silent. The phone on the wooden table by the window didn't ring, no messages were left, and the wall clock ticked steadily in an empty room. The prolonged stillness created an uneasy feeling, because Daisy always let someone know if she would be late, even if only by half an hour. The complete lack of any message made the family start checking the familiar spots around the house, the road leading to the small commercial area, and the places Daisy usually stopped by after work. Nowhere showed any sign she had been there. When night had fully fallen, and every reasonable possibility failed to provide an answer, the family faced a situation they couldn't resolve on their own. Daisy's absence became impossible to explain by any of her usual habits or daily routines. In growing anxiety, they decided to contact the Wheeling police to report that Daisy Moore had gone missing with no indication of why she hadn't returned home that evening. The Wheeling police received the call reporting Daisy missing that evening and immediately opened a missing persons suspicious circumstances file after verifying the initial information with the family. The decision to open the file under suspicious circumstances rather than waiting 24 hours was made quickly due to the unusual factors related to Daisy's daily habits. All family members confirmed that Daisy had no history of leaving home without notice, had never missed a shift, had no family conflicts, and was not affected by any personal disorder that could cause her to disappear on her own. Her personnel file at the company also showed that Daisy was disciplined, maintained regular hours, and always notified others of even small changes in her schedule. The consistent information led the police to assess the abnormality of the case as high right from the early stage. The investigative team began their work by establishing a search radius around the area where Daisy was last seen. A map of the route was spread out on the work table in a temporary office set up near the industrial area, with key points marked in red based on witness statements. This area was not one with heavy foot traffic. The narrow roads, dense rows of trees, uneven terrain, and limited lighting meant the sweep had to proceed slowly and meticulously. As they moved deeper into the search area, investigators discovered that Daisy's path leaving the industrial area did not match the route she normally took every day. Instead of following the straight road back to the residential area, Daisy had detoured through a narrow intersection where the shadow of the row of trees covered most of the light. This was not a logical route for someone walking home after work, especially when the afternoon light had already faded significantly. This gap in her movement caught the investigators' attention because it did not stem from forced circumstances or traffic conditions, but resembled an intentional action directed toward an undetermined meeting point. While investigators gathered statements from residents near the area, a man living in a house about 200 feet from the side road reported hearing a strange sound on the evening Daisy disappeared. The noise was brief, like a heavy impact or a short shout, as if there had been a collision or an argument between two people. He did not see the source of the sound because the window was fogged up and it was quite dark at the time, but what he remembered prompted the team to examine the ground around the row of trees more thoroughly. When floodlights were turned on, and the layer of dry leaves was brushed aside, marks on the soil began to emerge. Among them was a footprint that did not match the size of Daisy's shoes, indicating the presence of another person. Near the footprint was a faint drag mark, only a few inches long, not clear enough to identify its nature, but unusual enough to be noted in the scene report. The marks on the ground did not appear casual like those of a normal pedestrian. The disturbance in the soil suggested a pulling force or a strong impact in an uncontrolled motion. Investigators carefully marked the position of each impression and collected soil samples for later comparison. These findings were recorded without jumping to hasty conclusions, as they needed to be combined with other facts to determine their relevance to Daisy's disappearance. In parallel with examining the scene traces, the investigative team reviewed individuals who had direct contact with Daisy during her final shift. The personnel list from the industrial transport company was pulled, and from it, a small group of employees working in the same department as Daisy was added to the list for questioning. During the review, 3 names stood out in multiple internal reports: Daisy Moore, Victor Hale, and Martin Cole. These were the people connected to a shipment that the inventory department had flagged as mismatched quantities a few days before Daisy disappeared. A collection of emails, notes, and exchanges between the 3 was extracted from the internal management system, showing they had discussed the issue of weight and inventory listings multiple times. 2 other employees from the previous shift also mentioned that Daisy, Victor, and Martin had a private conversation near the warehouse area in the afternoon on the day of the incident. These signs began to create a notable connection between Daisy's work life and her sudden disappearance. The lead investigator on the case created an analysis chart based on all the initial data: Daisy's illogical route, the strange sound near the row of trees, the footprint and drag mark on the ground, the repeated appearance of the names Victor Hale and Martin Cole in internal reports, and the stability of Daisy's lifestyle. When these elements were placed side by side, the possibility that Daisy had left Wheeling of her own accord was deemed inconsistent. The manifestations at the scene and the clues tied to the industrial transport company suggested the involvement of one or more other individuals in Daisy's disappearance. The severity of the case was elevated, and the investigation was shifted to treat the disappearance as an act involving human intervention rather than a spontaneous departure. As the search team expanded the perimeter into the open land adjacent to the low brush area and the dirt road leading out of the industrial zone, a patrol unit discovered Daisy's silver sedan parked unevenly on hard-packed ground, surrounded by reeds and patches of grass bent by the wind. The car was positioned in a spot that didn't correspond to any route described by people familiar with Daisy, immediately marking this find as a critical detail. The location where the car appeared was quite desolate. The access road into the area had deep ruts left by trucks and was unsuitable for a woman walking at the end of the day. Police reviewed the map and noted that the distance between the industrial area, Daisy's usual route, and the car's location did not form a logical sequence for her journey. The car's appearance in that context felt more like external intervention than the result of personal choice. When the forensic team approached the area around the vehicle, they found impressions in the soil with varying depths and shapes, indicating uneven force applied by a person or object. Several drag marks several feet long became more visible under the lights, and the soil surface was disturbed in a direction suggesting someone had been pulled across the dry ground. Near where the car was parked, a shoe print with an unusual tread pattern appeared, significantly larger than the shoe size Daisy wore. The ridges on the sole did not match any footwear described by her family or coworkers. The depth of the impression indicated the person who left the print had considerable body weight, walked unevenly, and likely moved under stress. As technicians conducted a wider survey, a patch of flattened grass about 300 feet from the car caught their attention. The ground beneath this patch showed multiple shallow depressions, scraped areas, and short skid marks, suggesting forced collision or repositioning of a person. The distance between the car's location and this cluster of marks was neither close enough to be incidental nor far enough to rule out connection to the same sequence of events. Investigators marked the two sites as independent points for comparing surface disturbance density. The scene characteristics evoked the image of a victim being moved through multiple positions within the same area rather than stopping at a single point. While searching the nearby low brush, the team collected several items that did not belong to Daisy. A torn piece of black fabric caught on a branch appeared to have been stretched before snapping. A bottle cap from a lesser-known soft drink brand was found a few steps away, lying on fine gravel-covered soil. A length of industrial rubber cord was also recovered, showing surface abrasion that suggested it had been used to bind or secure something. When cross-checked with family-provided information, none of these items matched anything Daisy owned. The fact that these objects were near the car led investigators to question the presence of one or more strangers in the same area during the time Daisy disappeared. The tactical analysis team began sketching a three-point diagram: the spot where Daisy was last seen, the location where the car was found, and the cluster of marks farther back. These 3 points formed an irregular chain with a clear axis shift that made the victim's movement impossible to explain by simple walking behavior. The soil marks showed directional force changes consistent with a person being repositioned while restrained. Based on the density of drag marks, the pattern of ground settling, the orientation of shoe prints, and the distances between locations, the investigative team gradually formed a model of an abduction structured around multiple handling points. This model did not rely on a single perpetrator but indicated the possibility of coordination, or at least the involvement of multiple people in the same sequence of actions. When analyzing the disjointed nature of the clues, investigators noted they did not form a continuous line. Instead, each segment had distinct characteristics, reflecting an interrupted movement process resembling mid-course plan changes. The drag marks were not continuous, the shoe prints lacked consistent direction, and the foreign objects were scattered in several small clusters, all pointing to complexity rather than the simplicity of a sudden or random act. The inconsistent nature of the details suggested a picture of a situation carried out in multiple steps, with adjustments, repositioning, and likely occurring under conditions dangerous to the victim. The clues were carefully documented and entered into the simulation system for further analysis. Police viewed them as puzzle pieces that had not yet fit together. But clearly they did not carry the characteristics of someone voluntarily leaving the area. The investigative team added all the newly collected data to the main file, beginning to build the framework of an organized abduction involving the movement of the victim through multiple distinct handling points across the wasteland leading out to the edge of Wheeling. When the initial data was compiled, investigators began reconstructing Daisy's final journey by combining witness statements with the plausible routes she could have taken. People living near the industrial area described the locations where they saw Daisy appear, while the local map indicated the side roads, paths, and dimly lit intersections. These sources of information were pieced together to form a relatively clear picture of the path Daisy chose that late afternoon. The route she took was not the familiar one leading back to the residential area, nor was it the shortcut Daisy usually used when she wanted to shorten the distance. This choice led investigators to question the purpose of her movement. The area Daisy entered was described as a sparsely trafficked zone with weak lighting and limited visibility due to rows of trees on both sides blocking much of the streetlight. That area was outside Daisy's usual commuting habits, and the gap in her journey appeared precisely at the time she left the warehouse and before the car was found. Investigators cross-referenced the time the family confirmed Daisy left the company with the time witnesses heard the strange sound, and both aligned with the period when Daisy was moving through the deserted area. The convergence of these points created an unexplained blank spot in the journey that could not be accounted for by ordinary movement patterns. During the re-examination of the area near the row of trees, an old camera mounted on the wall of an abandoned building was discovered. The camera had long gone unmaintained and only captured blurry footage, but when investigators reviewed the recovered frames, a figure walking into the shadowed area came into view. The gait, height, and the way the bag was carried indicated a very high likelihood that it was Daisy. No other figure followed her in the frame, which made the possibility that Daisy was voluntarily heading toward a meeting point more noteworthy. Her path showed determination, with no signs of evasion or anxiety, in contrast to the image of a victim being pursued. When analyzing the context, investigators noted that Daisy's behavior did not exhibit characteristics of confusion or aimlessness. The moment she paused at the intersection, as described by the witness, showed deliberation, while her decision to walk deeper into the poorly lit area carried the tone of a purposeful choice. This analysis was reinforced when cross-checked against internal company emails. A log from the internal switchboard showed that Daisy had begun making a call right before she left work. The call was not completed. The content was left unfinished, and the other end was not clearly identified because the system automatically deleted old internal calls, but the timing of the call coincided with the period when Daisy left the company. This feature led investigators to consider the possibility that Daisy was trying to contact someone to confirm a meeting she intended to have at the end of the day. The incomplete call, combined with the evidence from the camera and the unusual route, created the image of a person stepping into an appointment without sharing the information with family or coworkers. When all the collected data was assembled, the investigative team began constructing the last known movement model, a form of reconstructing the victim's final journey based on every piece gathered. This model set the starting point as the industrial area gate where Daisy departed, then connected to the location where the witness saw her pause to consider and extended in the direction she walked into the dark area. The figure in the camera reinforced the direction of travel, and the traces discovered at the site where the car was found provided a physical endpoint on the analysis map. The segments in the model showed that Daisy left her familiar area intentionally, following a route that only someone with the intent to meet another person would choose. The recorded journey could not be viewed as an aimless path or the result of confusion, because Daisy was a creature of habit in her movements and had no reason to veer into the deserted land. The combination of the unusual route, the unexplained gap in the journey, the figure in the camera, the interrupted internal call, and the location where the car appeared made the final journey model the central focus for the entire direction of the investigation. As the investigative team began working with individuals who had direct contact with Daisy during her final shift, the two names that appeared most frequently in the internal files were Victor Hale and Martin Cole. Both worked in the shipment management department, responsible for inventory control and signing off on the transport items that Daisy handled cross-checking for. When summoned to the police station for initial statements, Victor and Martin both claimed they left the company earlier than Daisy and did not encounter her at the end of the day. However, these statements quickly ran into contradictions when investigators cross-checked their departure times against the company's electronic shift log. The data showed both men swiped out of the storage area much later than they claimed, and an old security camera at the side exit captured Martin's figure in the rear corridor at a time after Daisy had already left the company. The discrepancy between their verbal accounts and objective data prompted investigators to scrutinize the truthfulness of both men more closely. What drew attention was not only the inaccuracies in their statements, but also the way the two described that afternoon in an unusually similar manner. For example, when asked about the pace of work that day, both Victor and Martin responded with nearly identical phrasing, including descriptions of a short break, the status of inventory, and how they wrapped up their shifts. This level of similarity went beyond natural reflex, giving the impression that they had coordinated in advance what they would present. Their phrasing lacked randomness and resembled a shared script repeated in sequence. Investigators noted this detail in the file, because such a high degree of matching is often a sign of concealing information or deliberately reshaping the timeline. When the scope was expanded to the weeks leading up to Daisy's disappearance, the team discovered that Daisy, Victor, and Martin had all been involved in overseeing the same shipment that had been flagged for regulatory violations regarding weight. The issue with this shipment had led to multiple internal exchanges, including notes about mismatched quantities and requests for re-inventory. The content of the report showed that Daisy had objected to signing off on certain items that had not been fully inspected, and both Victor and Martin were the ones accountable to management for explanations. This work-related connection, under regulatory pressure, led investigators to consider the possibility of prior discord among the three before Daisy vanished. When questioning other coworkers, one reported overhearing the three arguing about non-compliant transport documents in the storage area 2 days before Daisy disappeared. The argument was described as not escalating to outright hostility, but the atmosphere was tense enough for the listener to sense a lack of agreement among them. This aligned with Daisy's personality. As described by family and colleagues, she was serious about her work and did not easily accept procedural shortcomings. Daisy confronting the two colleagues directly responsible for the non-compliant shipment added further complexity to everything in the file. As investigators continued to observe how Victor and Martin responded throughout the statement process, the contrast in their attitudes became a noteworthy point. Victor displayed a calm that was almost inscrutable, speaking clearly and showing no signs of anxiety. Despite numerous contradictions in his story compared to verified data, his demeanor remained undisturbed, as though he had prepared for these questions and only needed to maintain a steady rhythm in his responses. In contrast, Martin constantly shifted in his seat, avoided eye contact, and tended to ask to revise his answers immediately after finishing them. Whenever investigators pressed on segments related to the end of the workday or their whereabouts after hours, Martin answered in a strained voice, and his hands clenched with each difficult question. This opposition not only reflected different personalities but also created an impression of the varying levels of pressure each man was under. The investigative team documented all these behaviors for use in analyzing the reliability of their statements. After compiling the factors, including their recorded presence times at the company, the nature of the work connected to Daisy, the internal dispute over the shipment, and the unusual overlap in their statements, the police placed Victor Hale and Martin Cole on the list of persons of interest. The fact that both men appeared, with multiple signs of inconsistency with the data, combined with their close connection to Daisy before her disappearance, made them the two central figures in the initial investigative direction. As investigators compiled the internal documents related to the Goods Management Department, initial details about a federal regulatory violation began to emerge more clearly. The shipment that Daisy, Victor, and Martin were jointly responsible for was not just a minor inventory discrepancy, it also fell under the category of tightly controlled equipment according to federal transportation regulations. Old archive documents showed that the inspection department had previously requested a review of this shipment the year before, and the errors in the records appeared to have persisted for many months, without legitimate justification. Upon deeper analysis, investigators noted that Daisy was not only the one recording the data, but also bore responsibility for final document authentication. Her signature, being the critical step that approved the file, made Daisy's role in the team heavily weighted with accountability, while simultaneously creating pressure on those who might exploit discrepancies to conceal issues. Several deleted reports in the system were recovered, and revealed that Daisy had once refused to sign an inventory declaration that Victor and Martin had proposed for approval. In that declaration, certain items had their weights altered downward to avoid federal inspection. Daisy noted that the items failed verification standards and needed re-inspection before signing. The presence of this note showed that she had detected abnormal signs regarding the shipment and refused to participate in any fraudulent action. This shifted the nature of the connection among the three individuals entirely away from a typical internal conflict model. When examining the communication timeline between Daisy and her two colleagues in the days leading up to her disappearance, The technical team recovered several internal emails that had been deleted from the main system. The content of the messages did not directly admit wrongdoing, but the language and tone of the exchanges clearly conveyed tension. One email sent from Victor's account stated that the inconsistency needs to be resolved faster, and another reply from Martin included the phrase "can't delay any longer." In the context of the analysis, these words reflected a need to force the handling of the file rather than normal discussion. Investigators remarked that the rising pressure among the three coincided precisely with the time Daisy began asserting an independent stance on the shipment. A coworker in the same storage department stated that Daisy had confided in him that she was going over everything very carefully because something wasn't right. The coworker also recalled a statement Daisy had made: "If this drags on any longer, it's going to affect a lot of people." This testimony indicated that Daisy was aware of the seriousness of the issue and intended to clarify it rather than remain silent. Another part of this coworker's statement carried significant weight when he mentioned Daisy knew more than those two guys thought. This remark was not speculative, but was made after the coworker had observed Daisy's actions and how she handled documents in the final weeks. The way Daisy filtered data, remarked weights, and checked anomalous items signaled that she was approaching full identification of the entire nature of the violation. Daisy holding such sensitive information raised the level of risk significantly for those directly tied to the irregularity. When comparing the content of the recovered emails, inventory notes, the timing of the witnessed argument, and Daisy's sudden disappearance, investigators gradually formed a tight connection between the non-transparent shipment and the circumstances of her vanishing. These facts provided a reasonable foundation for the hypothesis that Daisy intended to step away from the group and might have reported to federal authorities if the situation was not handled properly. Her firm adherence to work standards made that possibility credible, inadvertently placing her in a position that directly threatened the two remaining men in the group. When analyzing these indicators, investigators explicitly noted in the file that this was no longer a question of minor workplace conflict, but bore the characteristics of an underlying criminal structure with a clear objective: maintaining illicit transport operations. The information about Daisy showed she did not cover up issues and had no tendency to compromise when the errors were too significant. This transformed the relationships among the three from mere colleagues into a highly risky, interdependent dynamic in the event of disagreement. The emergence of email data, altered inventory reports, and testimony about Daisy knowing too much led the investigative team to consider internal criminal motive within the group as a factor with real weight. These signs added an important dimension: the level of threat that Daisy unintentionally posed to the non-compliant transport operation may have been substantial enough to provoke extreme action from those with direct interests tied to her silence. When all this data was entered into the file, the investigators' initial assessment of the potential for criminal violations within the group grew increasingly solid. When the forensic technical team transferred the evidence collected from the area around Daisy's car to the analysis lab, the initial results began to create an important link between the disappearance and a location that had been inactive for many years. Soil samples clinging to the edge of the car door and grains embedded deep in the tire treads were separated for mineralogical identification. The comparison results showed that this soil contained a mixture of clay minerals and a characteristic type of industrial dust commonly found at Riverbend Storage Yard, a former storage yard once used for heavy equipment. The mineral composition in the soil from Riverbend Zone C almost perfectly matched the samples collected at the scene, including tiny dust particles originating from old machinery, something not common in other areas of Wheeling. When the nylon fibers stuck at the base of the reeds near where the car was found were analyzed, the results pointed in the same direction. This type of nylon carried an identification code from a coil of cargo binding rope used in the Riverbend area before the site was shut down in 1983. Those coils had stopped being distributed many years earlier, and the remaining stock existed only in places that had once stored heavy industrial goods. The laboratory also determined that the torn canvas fabric found in the bushes near Daisy's car had the same weave pattern as the oil-resistant canvas used to cover equipment once stored in Zone C, featuring the distinctive horizontal-vertical fiber pattern of the old oil-proof canvas line. These pieces of evidence not only carried industrial markers but also pointed to a specific origin, making Riverbend Zone C the priority location for inspection. Daisy did not work at Riverbend and had no history of travel connected to that area. Riverbend Zone C had been sealed off since 1983, after an incident in the old equipment processing line, resulting in the entire area being cordoned off and access restricted. The fact that Daisy appeared in a place she had no reason to visit, with physical evidence bearing the imprint of that yard, suggested the possibility that someone else had brought her there or moved her through the corresponding area. When investigators reviewed the personnel files of Victor and Martin, a noteworthy detail emerged. Before Riverbend Zone C was shut down, both men had been assigned to assist in the cleanup of old equipment and the transfer of goods to another storage site. In the past work logs, Victor was tasked with inspecting leftover pallets, while Martin was assigned to remove and sort the nylon binding ropes. Although the two only worked at Riverbend for a short period, their access timeline showed they had clearance to the area right up to the time of closure. This made the connection between the evidence and the two suspects far more significant, since Daisy had no opportunity whatsoever to come into contact with materials or soil characteristic of Riverbend Zone C. When the investigative team examined further details about the disputed shipment the three were handling, they discovered that several industrial pieces of equipment listed with incorrect weights in the records were related to machine lines that had once been stored in Riverbend itself during its final years of operation. The equipment in the mislabeled category belonged to groups wrapped in oil-resistant canvas and typically secured with nylon rope identical to the type found at the secondary scene. The simultaneous appearance of these matching elements made the link between Riverbend Zone C and the disappearance an unavoidable focal point. After cross-referencing Victor's and Martin's movement history with company data, investigators noted that both had accessed Zone C storage space outside regular working hours on several occasions before the area was officially closed. Maintenance log entries even showed that Victor had repeatedly signed off on equipment scheduled for transfer as Zone C prepared for sealing. The possibility that the two still retained knowledge of old access routes or leftover inventory locations made the hypothesis that they used Riverbend as a transfer point highly noteworthy. When reviewing all the analysis results from soil, nylon fibers, canvas fabric to the work histories of Victor and Martin, investigators began to recognize a consistent structure between the physical evidence and the indicators present at the scene. The coincidence between the evidence and details tied to the suspect's past reached an alarming level. There was no reasonable explanation for Daisy to have come into contact with materials and soil bearing the imprint of Riverbend Zone C, and this made every trace collected stand out prominently in the investigation file. The existing evidence was not merely related to the industrial area in general, but carried identifiers specific to one very particular location. Investigators decided to open an independent investigative branch focused on Riverbend Storage Yard to determine why traces from that area appeared at the location where Daisy's car was discovered, and whether it had a direct connection to the shipment the three were handling before Daisy disappeared. As the investigative team continued to examine Daisy's car for any traces that could explain her disappearance, a stack of papers wedged under the passenger seat particularly caught the attention of the forensic technician. These sheets were torn at the edges, with uneven paper margins and numerous crease marks, showing they had been held by someone in a hurried state. When brought back to the analysis room, the tear line of the stack was compared to documents reported missing from the internal archive storage of the transport company where Daisy worked. The two paper samples matched completely in size, grid printing style, and code stamping method. One torn edge from the archived set had a serrated pattern that aligned perfectly with the remaining margins still attached to the paper found in Daisy's car. This exact match indicated that the sheet had once belonged to an official file set and was removed before Daisy left the company. Investigators examined the remaining content on the sheet and discovered a partial missing inventory table, with only scattered data cells related to the shipment that Daisy, Victor, and Martin had been arguing about regarding weight. What interested the investigative team even more was not in the data section, but in the handwritten notes in green ink along the margin. The soft, slightly right-leaning handwriting matched exactly the style in previous documents written by Daisy. The note read, "Meet H plus C before heading home. Don't let it drag past tonight. Daisy's use of the abbreviations H and C immediately led investigators to connect them to the names Hale and Cole, the two individuals who had appeared repeatedly in every unusual circumstance tied to the shipment and the internal confrontation. A follow-up note below clarified the context further. Don't agree. Need to talk before tonight. This phrase was written quickly, with the pen strokes forming slight tremors, as if the writer was in a rush or trying to jot down the main idea before taking action. The brief content carried major significance in reconstructing motive. It indicated that Daisy had a disagreement with Victor and Martin over a work issue, most likely related to the non-compliant shipment. This disagreement was not a minor procedural conflict, but one significant enough for Daisy to note the need for an immediate discussion that same day. The possibility that this meeting took place right before her disappearance turned every detail on the sheet into a crucial puzzle piece for the investigative direction. When analyzing the handwriting, the specialist confirmed that Daisy wrote the note not long before it was torn from the file set. The pressure of the pen on the paper still retained the state of someone in the mindset of deciding to do something difficult. When the backside was flipped, the investigative team discovered a faint impression of a section that had been cleanly torn away. That part appeared to have contained a longer note, but someone had deliberately ripped it out. The forceful tear left an uneven serrated mark, indicating the purpose was not to tidy the paper but to separate a specific piece of information from the document. Although the torn portion was gone, the fact that Daisy kept the remaining part in the car led investigators to infer that she intended to bring the document along for a direct conversation with Victor and Martin. Additionally, on the margin of the paper there was a smudged black ink mark, the type of ink commonly used in administrative signing pens at the company, showing that the sheet had once come into contact with another document, or that someone else had written or marked on the torn portion. This detail heightened suspicion that not only Daisy had handled the file set, but someone else had also left a trace before the document section was separated. One of the storage department employees, when asked if he remembered anything related to Daisy or her two colleagues on the final evening, mentioned that Daisy had carried what looked like a fairly thick stack of documents when she left the office. The employee did not know the contents of the stack but clearly remembered Daisy holding it tightly as though something important needed to be resolved. This information aligned with the appearance of the torn sheet in the car, reinforcing the inference that Daisy had indeed prepared for a direct exchange with Victor and Martin right before leaving the company. When all the data related to the torn sheet was compiled, investigators remarked that the act of tearing the paper was not intended to eliminate all evidence, but rather focused on removing a specific portion of content. It was possible the person responsible only wanted to take away the part containing sensitive information or details disadvantageous to them. However, they did not carry out the removal thoroughly, inadvertently leaving the remaining portion of the sheet as a clear indicator of the meeting between Daisy and the two suspects. The existence of the note, "Don't agree. Need to talk before tonight," simultaneously pointed to a key element. The meeting between Daisy, Victor, and Martin had an urgent and potentially contentious nature. The level of urgency was evident in Daisy's determination to meet in person rather than wait until the next day. As the investigative team reviewed the chain of events, they noted in the file that the torn document was the first piece of evidence confirming a secret meeting between Daisy and her two male colleagues right before she disappeared. This was a pivotal detail in reconstructing the entire sequence of events, and from the notes in Daisy's own handwriting, the police concluded that this meeting was the starting point of the chain of actions that led to her disappearance. As the search for Daisy stretched into early 1986 without any definitive findings, the Wheeling police reports gradually shifted to a more cautious tone. With no body, no eyewitnesses seeing Daisy attacked, and no direct evidence of violent behavior, opinions within the department began leaning toward the possibility that Daisy had left Wheeling on her own. Internal notes showed that many officers at the time believed a grown woman disappearing without a trace could stem from personal choice. This heavily speculative viewpoint formed when search teams found no shelter, belongings, or possessions of Daisy abandoned in the woods or industrial area, leading to the assumption that she might have deliberately left familiar locations. When the initial evidence was sent to the forensics unit, technological limitations in 1985 meant analysis results remained at a general descriptive level. Soil samples stuck to the car tires were not subjected to mineral analysis and were simply recorded as undetermined. The nylon fibers found in the reeds nearby were listed only as a segment of synthetic fiber, with no comparison to any samples in the database. The torn canvas piece was treated as random debris because there was no method to trace its origin under the rudimentary analysis equipment available. Physical traces such as drag marks, unusual shoe prints, or soil disturbances were not fully photographed before the patrol team moved through, causing many physical details to be permanently lost. The scene investigator noted that the traces were not clear enough to support a specific criminal behavior direction. When these notes were forwarded to the office, they were treated as isolated details, lacking weight, and filed under does not support investigative direction. Part of the reason the case stalled lay in how files were managed at the time. Several witness interview notes, including accounts of the strange noise, the mild argument between Daisy and her two coworkers, and inconsistencies in statements did not appear in the official case file. Evidence showed that many handwritten notes were left in a supplementary folder and never transferred to the main compilation. These notes described valuable observations, but were set aside because the clerical officer considered them not sufficiently verified or difficult to corroborate. When the file was reviewed for closure in 1986, these notes were not listed in the main table of contents, significantly reducing the weight of details that could have become key leads. The most puzzling aspect was that one page in the final compiled file was printed on a completely different type of paper from the rest. The paper was smoother, with straight even edges and darker ink printing compared to the older pages. This page contained a description of Daisy's personality framed as reserved, possibly enduring work pressure without voicing it, and summarized a speculation that she may have left Wheeling for undetermined personal reasons. The paragraph on this page did not contradict any previously entered content, but it did not align with the initial collected facts about Daisy's disciplined nature and stable habits. The fact that the document page was printed on different paper indicated it did not belong to the batch used in 1985, and several contemporary investigators questioned why this page had been substituted. However, since there was no procedure at the time to verify the authenticity of administrative documents as there would be later, the discrepancy was neither addressed nor further investigated. As field searches yielded no results, media pressure eased, and investigative work was diverted by other cases, Daisy's file was gradually pushed to low priority. By mid-1986, a closing report was prepared, concluding that there was no sufficiently strong legal basis to continue treating the matter as criminal. In this report, police recorded Daisy as an adult, capable of voluntary departure, with no direct evidence indicating coercion or homicide. Objective elements about physical evidence, unusual traces, and internal connections between Daisy and her two male coworkers were not emphasized or detailed. The original investigative file was closed and transferred to archive storage, under the designation of a missing person case with no progress. The lack of in-depth analysis of physical data, incomplete cross-checking of statement inconsistencies, and victim assessment based on assumptions rather than evidence caused the case to be closed prematurely. When the file was archived as a non-suspicious missing person matter, every clue about Riverbend Zone C, the internal disputes at the transport company, and details of the secret meeting Daisy had noted in the torn document were left buried in silent layers of paperwork. The administrative closure of the case occurred despite numerous signs indicating this was not a voluntary departure. The closure process obscured critical information, and investigative opportunities vanished when the official file was sealed in storage, leaving an unanswered void in the disappearance of Daisy Moore. In 1997, during the inventory of the Wheeling Police Department storage archive, a newly assigned administrative employee tasked with reviewing old files discovered a large brown envelope wedged in the gap between two thick file folders. The envelope was stamped with a 1985 seal, bore the faded signature of an on-duty officer from the period when Daisy disappeared, but it did not appear at all in the official evidence catalog. A thick layer of dust on the envelope's edges showed it had sat untouched in that spot for many years. Although sealed, the envelope had no designation for processing, making it a strange object among hundreds of clearly classified files. When the employee opened the envelope following inventory procedure, 3 items fell out. A small bag containing dried hydraulic oil clumped together, a scorched fragment of an ID card with singed edges, and an old Canadian coin. None of these items had any labeling notes or evidence coding. The fact that they were packaged in a sealed envelope without any descriptive information made their presence even more conspicuous. The hydraulic oil sample was identified by its distinctive smell and the layer of industrial dust clinging around it. This type of oil contained a specialized polymer component once used in the control systems of heavy industrial equipment, particularly the old machinery stored at Riverbend Storage Yard before Zone C was sealed off. This oil was not common outside industrial environments, and it had even less reason to appear in the file of a missing person case unless it was connected to a location that had been sealed for over a decade. When examining the scorched ID card fragment, the archive staff member recognized the partially burned letter D and the remaining portion of a name that belonged to a company employee ID. The metal chip on the card had become brittle and warped from high heat, causing the surface to discolor and the edges to shrink. The burn pattern was not consistent with natural low-heat burning. It showed signs of brief direct exposure to a strong heat source. This type of burn often appears when someone attempts to quickly destroy evidence by burning. The fragment was insufficient to identify the owner, but its size, material, and the printed code on the back indicated it belonged to the same line of employee ID cards used by Daisy's company in 1985. When compared to archived card samples from that year, the similarity was nearly absolute. The fact that the card had been partially burned raised questions about the intent of whoever had handled it. The Canadian coin inside the envelope was the most difficult item to explain because on the surface it seemed unrelated to the other evidence. However, a veteran officer called in to examine it recognized this specific coin type as one that had appeared in imported shipments from Canada, handled by Daisy's transport company in the fall of 1985. Those shipments belonged to the disputed lot that Daisy, Victor, and Martin were all responsible for inventorying. In many crates shipped from Canada, coins accidentally mixed into packing material or locked compartments were not uncommon, and inventory staff might keep them while recording weights. The coin's presence in the sealed envelope positioned it as a potential piece that directly linked evidence to the shipment that had been the focus of internal disagreement before Daisy disappeared. When the 3 items were placed side by side, the industrial dust-coated hydraulic oil, the scorched ID card fragment, and the Canadian coin, the picture that emerged no longer resembled an accidentally overlooked envelope. These items were not in the official seizure catalog and were not recorded in the original case report for Daisy. Their combination appeared more like evidence removed from the scene and then kept aside without following proper procedure. The items suggested 3 clear implications. The hydraulic oil pointed exclusively to Zone C. The burned ID card indicated an attempt to destroy something related to a company employee, and the Canadian coin matched the shipment source that Daisy had been scrutinizing intensely before her disappearance. The sealed envelope became a baffling detail for anyone reviewing it. Why was this evidence not processed through standard channels? Why would an on-duty officer seal it but not submit it to the main system? Why were 3 items bearing industrial markings kept separately in this way? These questions went unanswered in the 1997 context, but the envelope's existence showed that the initial handling of evidence in Daisy's case had been disrupted in an inexplicable manner. The sudden appearance of this unopened sealed envelope created a forgotten puzzle piece in a case that had been closed for over a decade. Each item inside carried details that could have shifted the investigative direction if analyzed at the proper time. The envelope slipping through the catalog highlighted inconsistencies in archiving procedures and reflected the fragmented state of the entire matter since the day Daisy vanished. With 3 highly specific pieces of evidence, the envelope's existence stood as proof that much critical information had gone unexploited, leaving a major gap that kept the case locked in prolonged silence without resolution. When the outdated analysis lab from the 1980s could not take Daisy's case any further, all evidence was sealed in storage for many years. It was not until 2012 when the police department implemented modern soil profiling technology during a review of cold cases, that the soil samples collected from Daisy's car and the reed area near the secondary scene were submitted to the new generation mineralogical analysis system. Soil profiling allowed the separation of individual mineral layers, soil structure, impurities, and characteristic industrial traces, creating a geological fingerprint unique to each location. The results showed an almost perfect match. The soil sample from the scene carried a mineral structure that exactly matched the characteristics of Riverbend Zone C, including silica particles, accompanied by industrial dust from old hydraulic equipment, and a heavy metal contamination profile specific to the dismantled processing line that had been taken apart before 1983. The soil composition of Zone C did not appear commonly across Wheeling, because the industrial machinery there used hydraulic oil and metal compounds from equipment lines that had been banned many years earlier. The mineral mixture in the sample showed near absolute similarity to the standard sample extracted from Riverbend storage yard. The presence of tiny crescent-shaped iron oxide particles embedded in the soil alone was sufficient to pinpoint the origin. This rendered Victor's and Martin's 1985 statements claiming they never went to Zone C completely untenable. Soil profiling does not rely on memory or testimony but on the natural properties of minerals, so any form of denial became meaningless when the soil recovered from the scene matched perfectly with the area the two men had access to many years earlier. When technicians analyzed each dust particle in the soil sample, they detected the presence of micrometallic particles originating from hydraulic compressors of a banned generation. These microparticles existed as extremely fine fragments that only appear when an industrial device shows severe wear. The metal composition of these microparticles matched the type of machinery once preserved in Zone C, the same equipment group as the disputed shipment that Daisy, Victor, and Martin were handling before she disappeared. This match formed a physical link between Daisy's disappearance and the very shipment at the center of the internal conflict within the transport company. The presence of microparticles from banned industrial components on evidence from the area around Daisy's car proved that she had either come into contact with or been forced into contact with an area containing such equipment. This could not have occurred randomly because Zone C had been sealed off, and no one in the company was permitted to enter anymore. The specific soil type combined with industrial microparticles adhering to the evidence constituted objective proof, stronger than any testimony collected in 1985. It not only demonstrated that Daisy had been present in Zone C, but also confirmed that Victor and Martin had lied throughout their entire account of their movements after the shift. When cross-referencing the analysis data with the old statement records, investigators noticed that every description given by the two men deliberately avoided mentioning Riverbend. They recounted travel routes, time clocks, and unrelated details to construct a stable timeline. But soil profiling completely dismantled this structure with an irrefutable detail. Daisy had been in Zone C, or had been taken through that area. The soil particles lodged in the tire treads and under the door edges previously recorded only as undetermined soil turned out to be the piece of evidence capable of shattering the decades-long cover-up. Geological evidence is often considered a passive form of proof, but in Daisy's case, it became the strongest anchor, pushing for the reopening of the file. Soil profiling also revealed that the soil adhering to the drag marks at the secondary scene was not from residential areas or currently operating industrial zones, but rather long compacted soil mixed with discontinued industrial profiling, additives a signature impossible to fabricate. When the analysis samples returned with such unified results, the investigative unit recorded that no room remained to view the disappearance as voluntary departure. The preliminary conclusion of the 1986 file immediately became baseless when confronted with physical evidence. There existed no rational reason for Daisy to go to Zone C on her own, a closed, non-operational site that was not on her usual route. The appearance of Zone C soil on the evidence meant Daisy had been brought there or transported through it by vehicle or by someone else. This became the pivotal turning point that shifted the entire case's meaning. It no longer belonged in the category of missing person with no criminal indication, but emerged as a criminal case with clear internal involvement. When soil profiling confirmed the soil origin, the metallic microparticles, and the connection to banned industrial equipment, the investigative team issued a new assessment. The link between Daisy and the non-compliant shipment was not merely a workplace coincidence, but could have been the direct cause of her disappearance. Breaking Victor's and Martin's statements through a scientific method immune to subjective influence became the first breakthrough strong enough to challenge the entire 1986 conclusion. From this point, the cold case was reopened along an entirely new direction, with the record stating that Daisy's disappearance was highly likely the result of an internal homicide tied to illicit operations within the transport company and the concealment of banned equipment at Riverbend Zone C. When the cleanup project for the old Riverbend storage yard was implemented in 2025, the list of containers sealed since the 1980s was reviewed again to classify leftover assets. In the catalog, one name stood out: Container 5-14, sealed at the end of 1985, a time that coincided exactly with the days Daisy disappeared, and also with the period when Riverbend Zone C was cordoned off. When the inventory team proceeded to reopen 5-14 following proper legal procedure, the scene inside caused the entire staff to pause their work. The cramped space contained a mix of old industrial items: a half-torn burlap sack, a pair of gloves coated in dried hydraulic oil, a broken-in-half ID card with Daisy Moore's name scratched across the photo section, and a length of industrial strapping cord that had shrunk at the outer edge with a long strand of hair caught between two layers of nylon fibers. None of these objects appeared in any 1985 inventory list, creating the impression that this container had been used without authorization. The torn burlap sack, when flipped over for inspection, showed scrape marks consistent with being dragged across rough ground. The burlap fibers were broken unevenly, bearing traces of heavy tension from being pulled rather than natural wear. The gloves coated in hydraulic oil matched the type that had appeared in the sealed envelope discovered in 1997, establishing a clear connection between the container and Zone C. The thin layer of oil on the gloves contained a blend of polymer and ground metal particles, characteristic components of the banned equipment in the shipment that Daisy, Victor, and Martin had been responsible for. Daisy's ID card, broken in half, drew far more attention than any other item. The break was sharp, straight, and showed no signs of aging over time, suggesting it had been snapped under direct force. The plastic edge at the break remained crisp, unworn despite 4 decades passing. This indicated the card had been broken before being stuffed into the container. The presence of Daisy's ID card inside a space locked since 1985 created a direct link between her disappearance and internal activities at Riverbend. The industrial strapping cord, the heavy-duty type used to secure large equipment, was found with a long black hair strand tangled in its coils. Case file records described Daisy as having dark brown hair that reached her mid-back, making the hair a piece of evidence capable of directly linking to the victim. However, preliminary testing showed that blood traces on the cord did not match Daisy's blood type, but belonged to O+, opening an entirely different question: the presence of a third person at the time the container was used illicitly. When forensic staff examined the bloodstain closely, they determined it had adhered to the cord while still wet upon contact, proving it was not an old stain that had accumulated before the cord was placed in the container. This information increased the likelihood that the container had been used as a site for handling evidence or moving a victim, and the person who left the blood had been present during that process. The fact that the blood did not match Daisy proved the involvement of someone beyond the 2 main suspects. While reviewing old documents, an archive specialist discovered the faint marking 514 along the bottom edge of the torn paper found in Daisy's car. Previously, this marking had been dismissed as meaningless ink smudges due to the paper being scratched. When placed next to the newly opened container's designation, the marking matched perfectly, creating a direct connection. Daisy had written 514 inches an internal document before she disappeared, meaning she knew about the container or had arranged a meeting related to it. This discovery gave all the evidence inside the container far greater legal weight than objects randomly discarded inside. When DNA samples from the hair strand and the bloodstain were submitted for extended analysis, unexpected results emerged. The DNA did not match Victor or Martin, but matched another name that had appeared in the transport company's auxiliary roster: Evan Briggs. Briggs was not a full-time employee during Daisy's tenure, but appeared in subcontract records and had participated in some off-hours cargo movement tasks at the request of the management department. Evan Briggs had fallen outside the scope of the 1985 investigation because no data directly linked him to the non-compliant shipment, but he appeared in labor assignment notes at Riverbend a few weeks before Zone C was sealed. The DNA from Container 5 to 14 confirmed Briggs's physical presence in the space connected to Daisy's disappearance. This match caused the initial structure of two main suspects to collapse and forced the investigative force to expand the analysis to a three-person model. Briggs's appearance in the container holding Daisy's evidence indicated he played a role in the events that caused her disappearance, or was directly involved in moving evidence afterward. When the investigative unit assessed the combination of the torn burlap sack, oil-coated gloves, broken ID card, strapping cord with hair, and O+ bloodstain, the image of Container 5 to 14 no longer fit within the scope of a forgotten storage unit, but emerged as a key handling point in a chain of internal criminal actions. The evidence showing signs of coercion, attempts at destruction, and industrial traces matching Zone C reinforced the hypothesis that the container had been used as a temporary holding or transfer location for the victim. Considering the 514 marking that appeared in the torn document, investigators realized Daisy had known this container played an important role in the issue she wanted to confront Victor and Martin about. This made the container's containment of a series of items directly tied to Daisy the culmination of a logical chain of connections. Container 5 to 14, when opened in 2025, immediately became the center of the renewed investigation, pulling the entire case out of its 4-decade cold case status. When the evidence inside Container 5 to 14 was connected to the torn document and internal records, the investigative team began reconstructing the final meeting between Daisy, Victor, and Martin using the reconstruction method. The notes Daisy left behind, recovered data from the company system, and details from the 1985 statements showed that the meeting was not a routine exchange, but one Daisy had scheduled as a direct confrontation. The note, "Don't agree, need to talk before tonight," clearly reflected that Daisy had uncovered wrongdoing in the shipment and decided to confront them. When the facts were placed side by side, investigators noted that Daisy entered the meeting with the intention of distancing herself from the group and was considering reporting to federal authorities if the situation was not resolved. This was what put Victor and Martin in a threatened position. The level of tension was evident in the internal emails and in the testimony of an employee who had overheard their argument. When Daisy demanded an end to the falsification of the shipment records and insisted that the two take responsibility before management, the reconstruction model described Victor beginning to steer the exchange toward coercion and telling Daisy, "Don't make this any more serious." Martin, under pressure from co-signing the non-compliant documents, initially appeared confused and avoided debate, but was drawn in when Daisy stated she would not sign any further reports. When analyzing the sequence, investigators recorded that the time Daisy left the company coincided exactly with the window Victor could not fully explain in his 1985 statement. This reinforced the likelihood that all three had met in a deserted area near the side road leading into Riverbend. Reconstruction from witness information, footprints, and timelines showed the meeting took place at the intersection between the row of trees and the dirt path, the spot where Daisy was seen pausing for a few seconds before disappearing. This was regarded as the location where the dialogue turned into an argument. Daisy was believed to have stated outright that she would no longer participate and would report the matter. This firm decision made both Victor and Martin realize the risk that the chain of violations would collapse if Daisy acted. While they tried to find ways to silence Daisy, a critical turning point occurred: the appearance of Evan Briggs. Briggs had a role in off-hours cargo movement and had previously worked with Victor on equipment loading tasks in Zone C before the area was closed. The DNA traces in Container 5 to 14 confirmed Briggs's presence in the chain of events. Reconstruction described Briggs being called in by Victor under the pretext of helping handle the problem. Based on records and work connections, Investigators concluded Briggs was brought in to apply physical pressure on Daisy if she did not cooperate. When Briggs arrived, the situation changed completely. Daisy resisted, and this was reflected in the scrape marks on the burlap sack, the drag traces, and the strand of hair caught in the strapping cord. Those traces depicted a victim's desperate attempts to escape while being restrained. The intensity of the resistance forced all three men into a struggle, creating a violent context none of them could control. Reconstruction from the secondary scene showed Daisy being forced off the main path and dragged toward the area with disturbed soil. The distances between the points proved Daisy was not fully subdued but continuously tried to break free, forcing the group to move through multiple locations before gaining control. The movement chain extended through two positions, where Daisy's car was abandoned and the area farther back where the drag marks were deeper. Every trace pointed in one direction. Daisy was forcibly brought closer to Zone C. When reconstruction continued with the container 5 to 14 data, investigators noted the model led to the conclusion that Victor and Martin had not initially intended to kill Daisy. This conclusion was based on the fact that Daisy still carried documents in her ID card while being forced to move. The breaking of the ID card in half inside the container indicated an impulsive act amid chaos. However, reconstruction also revealed another factor. Briggs was the one who pushed the situation beyond mere threats. The O+ blood stain in the container, not belonging to Daisy, showed Briggs was injured during the struggle, proving Daisy fought back fiercely. This plunged the trio into panic over the fear that Daisy might escape or call for help. When these elements overlapped, reconstruction clarified that the motive for murder no longer stopped at internal workplace conflict, but shifted to a combination of co-conspirator disagreement and fear of exposure. The possibility of Daisy going public would bring criminal liability and expose the network handling banned equipment. For Victor, the one with the most access to Zone C, and Martin, the one responsible for signing the records, Daisy became a direct danger. Briggs, brought in to assist with restraint, became the catalyst for violent behavior when the strapping cord appeared as a tool of coercion. When the reconstruction map was completed, the directional arrows of movement, evidence, and traces created a unified scenario. Daisy entered the meeting intending to leave the group and report the illicit operations. Victor and Martin sought to prevent it. Briggs was brought in for coercion. Daisy's resistance caused the situation to escalate, and the points of movement gradually led Daisy toward Zone C, where container 5 to 14 became the center of the entire criminal chain. The combination of these facts formed a complete abduction model and revealed the motive for killing Daisy built on shared complicity, mutual secrets, and fear of being reported. When the DNA in container 5 to 14 pointed to the presence of Evan Briggs, the investigative team immediately re-examined the entire 1985 file and noticed an unusual gap. There was no record of any interrogation or questioning related to Briggs. His name appeared in the subcontract list, in labor assignment orders, and in overtime payslips, but it was completely absent from the initial investigative documents. Briggs's absence from every official interview created a major question mark, especially since reconstruction showed he was present in the chain of events surrounding Daisy. When cross-referenced with personnel records, investigators discovered that Briggs was not a full-time employee but was hired on a flexible basis for heavy cargo transport outside regular hours. This made him less noticeable at the time of Daisy's disappearance, because most investigative efforts then focused on those working direct shifts. However, the DNA trace on evidence from container 5 to 14 proved that Briggs had directly handled the strapping cord and items related to Daisy, making his role impossible to overlook. Archived records revealed another noteworthy piece of information. Briggs vanished from Wheeling in 1987 without leaving any new address, tax records, or change of residence paperwork. His disappearance occurred in a strangely coincidental time frame with the period when Victor and Martin also left Wheeling to work in another state. All three departed the city within a span of less than 6 months. This sequence of events led investigators to suspect that Briggs did not leave Wheeling for purely personal reasons. When checking the transport company's assignment slips, the investigative team found that Briggs was called in on short notice on the exact day Daisy disappeared, within the time frame matching when Daisy left the industrial area. One of the entries showed Briggs assigned to internal transport support on orders from the Inventory Management Department. Although the job description was vague, it aligned with signs that Victor and Martin needed a third person to handle the situation when Daisy threatened to leave the group and report the violations. A witness living near the Wheeling industrial area recounted that on the afternoon Daisy vanished, he saw a small black truck parked close to the fence near the side exit. The man standing next to the truck had a build similar to Briggs, as shown in the personnel photo investigators located. The witness remembered the man wearing a brown jacket, a baseball cap, and constantly looking toward the warehouse area. The small black truck was not on the company vehicle list, but matched the type Briggs typically used when called for extra work. At the time, the witness thought it was just an ordinary loader, but that statement now became a crucial puzzle piece. When combining the witness account with the chain of evidence, the reconstruction model showed that Briggs may have been the one responsible for moving Daisy away from the initial argument site. The traces in container 5 to 14, including the strapping cord, burlap sack, and gloves, indicated that the hands carrying out the restraint likely belonged to Briggs, because only he left direct DNA on the evidence. This did not exonerate Victor or Martin from the role of masterminds, but showed a three-person group structure in which Briggs held the operational role. When delving deeper into the relationships among the three men, the investigative team realized that Briggs had participated in multiple equipment handling sessions at Zone C alongside Victor, creating a deeper connection between the two than ordinary co-workers. Briggs came from a blue-collar background and often took jobs others avoided, making him susceptible to being pulled into discrete operations. If Daisy threatened to expose the violations, Briggs would have been the most suitable choice to assist Victor and Martin in ways the two could not manage alone. Another hypothesis emerged when investigators examined the O+ blood stain in the container. The blood did not belong to Daisy or the two main suspects but matched Briggs's medical records from his time in Wheeling. This indicated Briggs was injured during the restraint of Daisy, most likely due to her strong resistance. Having one member of the group wounded escalated the chaos and added pressure to eliminate Daisy before she could escape and report everything. This created new logic. Briggs was not merely involved but became a critical knot in the escalation of violence. When reconstructing the timeline for 1987, investigators noted that Briggs no longer appeared in any records after August. There were no vehicle registrations, no job transfers, no medical records, and no official signs of leaving the state. The timing of Briggs's disappearance aligned precisely with when Victor and Martin simultaneously changed their residences. The possibility that Briggs was eliminated to prevent any risk of disclosure became a well-supported hypothesis, especially since Victor had the most access to heavy equipment and had handled many situations requiring mechanical force. When all the pieces were placed in their proper positions, investigators reached the conclusion that the criminal structure was not limited to the two people the old file had suspected. The truth showed that three individuals were initially involved: Victor in the controlling role, Martin in the supporting role, and Briggs in the enforcement role. However, only two remained alive to be prosecuted. The name Evan Briggs became a symbol of the dark shadow in the Daisy case, the man present in the chain of actions but erased from every official record, leaving behind DNA, a blood stain, and a series of questions that never received answers. When the forensic results from container 5 to 14 and the soil profiling were presented to Martin during the expanded interrogation, the calm he had maintained for so many years began to crack. The DNA of Briggs, on the strapping cord, the O+ blood stain, the hydraulic oil sample clinging to the gloves, and the appearance of Daisy's ID card inside the container shattered the entire story Martin had told in 1985. Under the pressure of irrefutable physical evidence, Martin admitted what he had denied for 4 decades. Evan Briggs was present at the scene. This admission did not come calmly but erupted, as though he had been holding a massive stone for too long and could no longer keep hiding it. When asked why Briggs never appeared in the original file, Martin replied that it was Victor's decision and that Briggs was only called in to help clean up a problem. Martin's choice of words clearly showed he was still trying to distance himself from the criminal acts, but Briggs's appearance in the statement pulled the entire narrative in a completely different direction. Martin attempted to shift responsibility onto Victor, describing Victor as the one who gave orders, decided how to handle Daisy, and directed every action, while he himself only followed along to keep his job and avoid getting implicated. However, the forensics from container 5 to 14 told a different story. Fiber impressions on the burlap sack and strapping cord showed that two different men had handled these items together. Skin cell samples, claw marks, and the tension direction of the cord clearly indicated at least two forces acting on Daisy, not just one. The scrape marks on the burlap sack corresponded to a height and arm reach closer to Martin's build than Victor's. This placed Martin in a position where he could no longer deny an active role in the restraint sequence. When the analysis results were compared with the reconstruction map, investigators proved that Martin did not merely stand by while Daisy was forced to move. He was the one holding Daisy's upper body during the initial drag marks. The height, pull angle, and depth of the footprints all matched him more closely than Victor. The forensic truth rendered Martin's just following orders defense meaningless. When confronted with this evidence, Martin began to tremble and showed signs of losing control of his breathing. He admitted that Daisy had been struck during the initial confrontation. The first blow, according to him, came when Daisy refused to sign a new document Victor had prepared in advance. Daisy said she would report it, and Victor responded with a hard slap. But forensics showed that the person who continued striking afterward was not Victor but Martin himself. When confronted, Martin bowed his head and said he lost control because I was afraid Daisy would get away. This confession shattered the entire image Martin had constructed over 40 years, that of a man dragged in by Victor. In reality, forensics placed him at the center of the action, equal to or even more proactive than Victor at certain moments. As Martin began to confess more, the criminal group structure emerged more clearly than ever before. He described Victor as the one who set up the schemes to alter shipment weights, Briggs as the one tasked with cleaning up when brute force was needed, and himself as the one who maintained the records and controlled internal documents. The three formed a closed circle, each holding a piece of information. But only Victor and Martin had the ability to manipulate paperwork. Daisy became an unwanted variable when she discovered the weight discrepancies and demanded the records be redone. Martin admitted that Daisy was pulled into container 5 to 14 after the argument spiraled out of control. According to him, Briggs was the one who tightened the cord to restrain Daisy, but forensics showed Martin directly holding Daisy's arms as she tried to wrench free from the strapping. When asked why Daisy was not released, Martin answered with a simple sentence that captured the entire essence of the case. If she left that container, all of us would be caught. That statement put an end to every previous attempt to portray the incident as an accident or unintended. When investigators pressed further about Briggs, Martin said Briggs didn't live long after the Daisy incident. The statement implied that Briggs had been eliminated to keep the secret. Although Martin did not admit it outright, the subtext in every word suggested both he and Victor recognized Briggs as a liability. During further questioning, Martin admitted the group never intended for Daisy to leave the meeting alive. This was the first time in the entire investigation that the true motive was spoken aloud. Daisy was killed to silence her and protect the network tied to the banned equipment shipment. It was not a spontaneous conflict, not an accident, but a combination of fear, self-interest, and organized crime. When the interrogation concluded, Martin's statement redrew the entire map of events. Daisy entered the meeting intending to protect the truth. The three men united to keep the secret. Briggs carried out the restraint. Victor led, and Martin shifted from being coerced to actively participating. Martin's collapse paved the way for the first legal conclusion that reached the deepest truth of the case. Daisy Moore was murdered to keep her quiet. When Martin's confession began to reveal the true structure of the co-conspirator group, investigators turned to a data source that 1980s technology could not process: the Thermal Satellite Imagery Archive collected by NASA in 1985. This data had originally been stored in the Meteorological Agency's system for cloud observation and surface temperature monitoring, not designed for criminal investigations. However, with the new pattern recognition capabilities of AI technology, the previously unusable low-resolution image frames were rescanned. The AI was trained to detect anomalous heat signatures, particularly moving hotspots consistent with motorized vehicles. Among thousands of noisy frames, the system filtered out a faint sequence showing the appearance of a small vehicle, roughly the size of a light truck, moving through the Wheeling industrial area on the night Daisy disappeared. The thermal signature indicated the vehicle stopped at a point very close to the edge of Riverbend Zone C, precisely in the area that soil profiling had previously confirmed as containing traces of Daisy. Although the images were distorted by the resolution limitations of that era, the AI still recognized a distinctive movement pattern. The vehicle remained stationary for more than 12 minutes at a single location, then proceeded in a zigzag path, as if the driver were deliberately avoiding main roads. The heat models showed irregular engine activity, indicating repeated stop-and-go behavior. When investigators placed this data alongside Martin's statement, the correlation was striking. Martin admitted that Briggs had used a small truck to transport Daisy away from the argument site, but both he and Victor had denied any journey to Zone C. Yet the AI revealed a vehicle matching the size Briggs used during his employment, appearing in the satellite imagery that night. When the satellite data was fed into the AI for more detailed motion reconstruction, the system determined the vehicle left the industrial area at 7:48 p.m., stopped at the intersection where a witness had seen Daisy pause, then continued toward the dirt road leading into Zone C. The 12-minute stop aligned exactly with the time frame reconstruction identified as the period of Daisy's most intense restraint. The AI then processed additional infrared data, searching for surface heat anomalies at Zone C. The results showed container 5-14 emitting a higher than normal thermal signature, indicating the lid or door had been opened between 8:10 and 8:14 p.m., a detail that matched Martin's statement that Daisy was pulled into the container to prevent her from escaping. In parallel with the satellite image analysis, investigators re-examined the company's analog GPS logbooks, where drivers hand-recorded route codes in 1985. A crossed-out line in Martin's logbook showed his vehicle had made 3 movements on the night Daisy disappeared. This evidence had never been fully understood in the past because earlier technology could not verify routes. When cross-referenced with the AI-generated heat map, 2 of the 3 movements matched the small truck's path in the satellite imagery. The first was the departure from the industrial area. The second was the approach to the Zone C vicinity. And the third, and most critical, was the departure from Zone C heading westward toward the hill area, a route never mentioned in Victor's or Martin's statements. Martin's crossing out of this line was confirmed by the AI as an attempt to erase the timestamp, since the cross did not fully obscure the route code symbols. Thus, the third movement became objective evidence against both suspects. When the AI reconstructed a complete 3-dimensional map of the entire journey by combining thermal data, motion patterns, and the 1985 terrain model, the result showed a clear sequence. Briggs's or Martin's vehicle left the industrial area, moved to the meeting point with Daisy, headed into Zone C, stopped at container 5-14, then departed via a peripheral route to avoid detection by residents. This 3-dimensional map simulated ground elevation, tree shadow positions, industrial road axes, and areas of thermal impact, producing the most visually accurate and precise image ever generated in the case. It was compatible with every piece of evidence: drag marks, soil profiling, items in the container, Martin's confession, and Briggs's presence. When investigators entered this map into the file, it became a form of evidence with exceptional weight because it did not rely on human memory, was unaffected by time distortion, could not be manipulated, and allowed no room for coincidence. The satellite evidence revealed a crucial truth. Victor and Martin had lied about their entire movements that night, including their denial of reaching Zone C and their denial of the third journey. When the AI simulated the final movement of the vehicle leaving container 5-14, the thermal signature showed a very rapid U-turn, a maneuver indicative of panic or haste. This pattern aligned with the assessment that after Daisy was subdued, the co-conspirators left the scene in a state of loss of control. The AI data not only reconstructed the abduction route, but also nullified every denial by the suspects. There was no longer space for speculation or debate over recollection, because every heat point, Every motion streak and every step of the vehicle's path had been recorded since 1985. When the complete three-dimensional map was archived in the file, the case for the first time possessed fully objective evidence standing entirely outside the influence of the three suspects. This was the piece no confession could overturn, the piece confirming that Daisy had been taken to Zone C, handled inside Container 5 to 14, and transported by the three-man group through multiple points to conceal their actions. When the satellite analyses and reconstruction clearly mapped out the co-conspirators' movement route, the forensics lab continued processing all the evidence from Container 5 to 14 using the 2025 DNA technology suite, which allowed the separation of biological microparticles previously considered unanalyzable in the 1980s. The nylon strapping cord, the central piece of evidence in the restraint process when laser illuminated and scraped for deeply embedded dead skin cells between the twists, revealed broken strands of Daisy's hair. This hair sample had been forced into the nylon fibers in the direction of a strong pull, proving it snapped when Daisy's head was yanked backward. The nuclear DNA sequence from the hair sample matched Daisy's genetic profile completely, creating the first direct evidence that she had not merely come into contact with, but had been restrained by the very piece of strapping cord found in the container. This eliminated any possibility that Daisy had entered that space voluntarily. On a wooden pallet tie bar pressed against the container wall, the dried sweat layer that could not be analyzed in 1985 was separated into two distinct protein sample sets. When compared to biological records obtained from Victor Hale and Martin Cole, both sequences matched the profiles of the two men. The sweat absorption patterns ran horizontally, clearly showing they had gripped the pallet bar after it had already been coated in hydraulic oil. The coordination of sweat from both men on the same piece of evidence confirmed that Victor and Martin were both inside the container and had direct contact with objects related to the restraint act. These sweat traces were identified at two different positions, one at the end of the pallet bar, consistent with where someone holding a heavy load would place their hand, and one near the middle of the bar, where the other person would typically apply pulling or pushing force. The presence of the two biological markers at exactly the functional positions reflected a pattern of simultaneous action. When technicians examined the interior wall of the container, they found a faint handprint. The industrial oil coating it had previously caused it to be dismissed as worthless smudging. The new oil layer separation technology isolated the oil particles while preserving the underlying residual protein, allowing identification of the handprint's owner. The biological sequence showed the handprint belonged to Evan Briggs. This was the first time forensics confirmed that Briggs had not only participated in the restraint outside but had entered the container, reinforcing the three-perpetrator model operating in the same enclosed space. When Briggs's handprint was placed alongside the DNA samples in the strapping cord and the O+ blood stain found in the container, an obvious behavioral structure emerged. Briggs held the role of applying force, using the cord to strangle Daisy and injuring himself in the struggle. At the bottom of the container, technicians discovered multiple loose fibers, tiny strands that had been impossible to trace in the 1980s. These fibers had a cotton-nylon blend weave structure, dark brown in color, identical to the fabric threads from the jacket Daisy typically wore while working at the transport company. When cross-referenced with archived images, the jacket Daisy wore in the year she disappeared, provided by her family, had a slightly frayed collar area. The fibers in the container matched those from the collar region, showing Daisy had been pulled hard from behind, tearing the collar edge and shedding fibers onto the container floor. These fibers were not only proof she had been there, but also clearly described a forceful restraint action from the rear, perfectly matching the reconstruction of the struggle. When forensics constructed an interaction model between the three perpetrators and the victim based on DNA sample locations, pull directions, grip angles, and micro-residue traces, the model showed Daisy forced into a seated or kneeling position on the container floor, with Briggs standing behind her tightening the cord around her shoulders and neck, Victor holding her left arm, and Martin holding her right arm. The hydraulic oil samples on the pallet bar in the left corner of the container indicated the pallet had been shoved aside to create space, and it was this action that caused Victor's sweat to transfer onto the bar. Martin's biological sample in the middle of the pallet bar proved he had used his hands to assist in holding Daisy steady. From a technical perspective, the model showed the three men exerting force on Daisy in near simultaneous moments, not in disjointed sequence. This completely ruled out any possibility that one suspect was merely present by chance or arrived after the fact. When the DNA samples were assembled into a logical chain, the dataset showed Daisy restrained at multiple points. Hair traces in the strapping cord, collar fibers, sweat from the two suspects on the pallet bar, and Briggs's handprint on the container wall. Together they formed a closed circle of truth. Daisy was overpowered by the three men working in concert, brought into container 5 to 14, and controlled using industrial tools. Each DNA marker became a spatial temporal vector pinpointing the struggle. When the analyses were completed, no gaps remained in the story Victor and Martin had tried to construct for 40 years. The DNA evidence chain linked every action to every suspect, relying not on memory or testimony but on human physiology, friction forces, fabric fibers, and biological traces. It was evidence that could not be erased, altered, or refreshed at anyone's will. The 2025 forensic system completed the picture of the crime, bringing the investigation to the point where for the first time, it possessed a fully coherent logical chain to charge those responsible for Daisy Moore's disappearance. When the DNA evidence, satellite data, and reconstruction merged into an unbreakable logical chain, arrest warrants for Victor Hale and Martin Cole were signed simultaneously in Ohio and Kentucky. These two orders marked the end of 4 decades, during which both men had lived as ordinary individuals going to work, paying taxes, blending into their communities without anyone knowing they had once participated in a meticulously concealed kidnapping and murder. Ohio police deployed a tactical team to apprehend Victor in Columbus, where he lived in a quiet residential neighborhood and worked in equipment maintenance at a small business. As the task force approached, Victor realized what was happening and reacted on instinct from someone who knew all too well the sentence awaiting him. He bolted out the back door, cut across the neighbor's yard, and tried to climb over a wooden fence, but police had already blocked the escape route with patrol cars. The failed flight attempt ended with Victor being tackled to the ground right next to the porch. While being handcuffed, Victor tried to shout that he had only stood and watched, but his words lost all meaning when his own DNA appeared on the binding cord, the pallet, and container 514. His struggling only further showed that he had anticipated this day would come, he just hadn't known how it would arrive. In Kentucky, Martin Cole was arrested under completely opposite circumstances. He was working in a small machine shop, standing at a grinding bench with gloves on and noise-canceling earmuffs in place. When police entered and called his name, Martin slowly turned around with eyes that recognized everything. There was no attempt to run, no resistance, just the absolute acceptance of a man who had known his buried secret had been unearthed. His face carried a heavy expression, as if he had mentally prepared for this moment ever since the evidence in container 514 surfaced. While being handcuffed, Martin asked only one question. "Did you find everything?" His words held no denial, but rather a silent admission of his role in Daisy's death. Both Victor and Martin were placed in separate holding cells, facing the longest and heaviest list of charges the law could apply in an organized murder case. Murder in the first degree topped the list because the reconstruction, DNA, and satellite data proved the group of accomplices had intentionally caused death to cover up their criminal activity. Kidnapping was charged based on the chain of evidence clearly showing Daisy was forced to move through multiple points against her will. Conspiracy to commit murder was added because of the signs of coordination among the three men before, during, and after the crime. Each charge carried the maximum penalty, turning the upcoming trial into one of the oldest cases ever brought to court in the region. While the two suspects were being transported, police released critical information about the third individual. DNA in container 514, an O+ blood smear, and fingerprints allowed definitive confirmation that Evan Briggs had played a direct role in Daisy's kidnapping. However, death records obtained from neighboring states showed that Briggs had died years earlier in an accident that his family had never publicly disclosed. His body was buried in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Cincinnati. The cause of death at the time was recorded vaguely, with no in-depth investigation. When police confirmed the identity through DNA comparison, the conclusion was clear. Briggs had been dead too long to be prosecuted. His death closed the possibility of bringing all three men to trial, but it actually reinforced the behavioral model because Briggs's mysterious disappearance aligned with Martin's statement that Briggs had come to be seen as a threat to the group's safety. The arrest of the two surviving suspects after 40 years sent shockwaves through the Wheeling community. Many who had worked with Victor expressed disbelief when they learned of his involvement in the crime. He had no prior record, lived with his family, participated in neighborhood activities, and was regarded as quiet but friendly. Martin, meanwhile, was described by coworkers as humble, hardworking, and never causing trouble. The stark contrast between the image they projected to the community and the criminal truth in the file left the public unable to comprehend how they could have lived so calmly for 4 decades. Police confirmed that the two men's prolonged silence resulted from an unspoken agreement among the accomplices, each holding a piece of the secret for many years to protect their own role. The arrests were described by the media as a historic shock because they shattered the familiar image of two men once seen as model citizens. As the two suspects were brought before the public, the contrast between the lives they had built and the crime they had concealed highlighted the sophistication of the Daisy Moore case, a case that had seemed to vanish into the archives but still retained physical evidence strong enough to drag its perpetrators back into the light after 40 years. When the trial of Victor Hale and Martin Cole officially opened in federal court, the jury was led into the courtroom completely unaware of the scale of the case. None of them were prepared to see a 3D model reconstructing the entire kidnapping journey of Daisy Moore, built using AI data, NASA satellite imagery from 1985, soil profiling, next-generation DNA, and reconstruction from physical evidence. When the prosecution displayed the model, the courtroom lights dimmed, and heat signature lines, topographic maps, the small truck's trajectory, and virtual DNA layers emerged to form the most visually powerful presentation the law had ever used in a 40-year-old case. The prosecution did not begin with words, but with objective evidence. A faint but clear heat signal showing the small truck stopping at Zone C exactly when Daisy disappeared. A red trajectory marked the movement from the industrial area to container 514. Next, the model showed how Daisy was dragged through 2 different points, based on drag marks, fiber samples, and soil profiling. The integration of data layers forced the jury to see the case as a seamless sequence of images rather than disconnected events. When the model reached the container 514 segment, the system displayed Daisy's DNA on the binding cord, Victor's and Martin's DNA on the pallet, and Briggs's fingerprints on the container wall. A forensic analysis voice explained how these biological samples physically interacted. Direction of pull, cord curvature, applied force, sweat seepage position through the wood. Together, they formed a sequence that could not be interpreted in any way other than coercive behavior. When the lights came back up, the prosecution began its opening statement, with the sentence, "You just saw what 40 years ago humans could not see." Faced with this model, Victor maintained complete denial. He sat upright, stared straight ahead, and answered that he was never at Zone C on the night Daisy went missing. He denied knowing what Briggs was doing, denied the binding cord, denied the pallet, and even denied writing any document related to the irregular shipment. His lawyer tried to argue that the 3D reconstruction was merely a technical interpretation that could not replace direct evidence. But the problem was that every detail in the reconstruction was built from physical samples, soil, fibers, hydraulic oil, DNA, fingerprints confirmed by infrared techniques and surface analysis. Every point on the map had physical evidence backing it. This left Victor's rebuttal efforts without a clear foundation. Martin, in contrast, entered the courtroom with a lower posture, his face no longer showing the resistance it had at arrest. He admitted partial responsibility and acknowledged being in the container. However, he tried to minimize his role by stating that all decisions came from Victor. The prosecution countered by displaying a 3D image of the binding cord with glowing DNA regions, showing pulling force from 2 directions, from Briggs's position and from a position matching Martin's height. The simulation added a figure scaled to Martin's height, making the motion perfectly match the drag marks and fiber tilt direction. Martin's argument immediately faltered. Defense attorneys for both defendants tried to attack the forensics by claiming the 1985 satellite resolution was too low to identify the vehicle, but when the prosecution presented AI analysis, showing the heat signature matching the company truck's engine type and aligning with 3 stops recorded in the analog GPS log, the defense lost ground. Another lawyer questioned Daisy's DNA on the binding cord, but the prosecution showed fiber breakage spectroscopy, indicating a jerking force in coercive motion, something that could not be faked. When the defendants were accused of trying to break the forensics by attacking isolated points, the prosecution responded with a question. If everything was random, why did every coincidence converge on one location? Zone C? That argument left the entire courtroom silent. When the trial moved to soil profiling presentation, the prosecution displayed samples of Zone C soil and soil from Daisy's tire grooves on screen. The silica framework, crescent-shaped iron oxide, and industrial polymer ratio were traces that only appeared when soil absorbed dust from old hydraulic equipment grinding. No other area in Wheeling had this soil type. Soil profiling made any claim that Daisy was never at Zone C meaningless. Forensics also showed how fibers found in the container matched the weave structure of Daisy's shirt. When ultraviolet light made the fabric fibers fluoresce, the jury saw simultaneously abrasion marks on the collar, fiber samples in the container, and Daisy's shape in the company photo. This match became proof that Daisy was forced to Zone C with no other option. The motive analysis came when the prosecution presented internal email chains, incorrect weight inventories, and Daisy's handwritten notes about refusing to sign. When the torn paper fragment marked 514 was matched to container 514 containing the evidence, the criminal group's motive emerged clearly like a diagram. Daisy knew about the irregularities. Daisy threatened to report. The 3-man group united to silence her. Briggs carried out the coercion. Victor directed. Martin assisted in holding Daisy. When the full forensic data satellite DNA reconstruction was presented in sequence, the courtroom realized they were witnessing a case where science filled every gap left by humans. The trial was quickly described by the press as a national case study because it demonstrated modern forensics' ability to reconstruct a truth from 40 years ago with near absolute precision. The confrontation between forensics and testimony became so lopsided that every denial effort by the 2 defendants failed to create any reasonable doubt. By the end of the trial day, the only remaining question was not whether they were guilty, but which sentence would properly reflect what Daisy Moore endured in container 514. In the gray morning at the federal courthouse, the courtroom fell completely silent as the clerk stood up and announced that the sentencing hearing had officially begun. No one in the gallery still felt like they were witnessing the end of a contemporary trial. Everyone understood they were standing before the conclusion of a case that had stretched across 4 decades, a case in which, for all that time, Daisy Moore had existed only as cold files, scattered physical evidence, and questions that had never been answered. When the judge entered, the sound of the gavel struck not just as the opening of a verdict, but as confirmation that justice, even arriving 40 years late, could still appear in its clearest form. The sentence for Victor Hale was read first. He stood up, wrists cuffed but his back still trying to stay straight the way it had throughout the years he hid the truth. Yet Victor's eyes showed he had recognized the weight of the scientific evidence the court had reviewed. The judge read each word clearly, determining that Victor was guilty of murder in the first degree, kidnapping, and criminal conspiracy, based on the irrefutable chain of forensic evidence. His DNA adhered to the pallet inside container 514. Satellite data proving the vehicle he used made 3 abnormal movements on the night Daisy disappeared, and the 3D reconstruction pinpointing the exact position where he held Daisy's arm while she was being forced. For those charges, the court imposed the harshest penalty: life imprisonment without parole. The phrase "without parole" landed in the courtroom like a heavy metal block, ending every last hope Victor had clung to throughout the trial that he might convince the jury to believe his story of innocence. Victor's gaze dropped to the courtroom floor. He no longer searched for support or any defense. Even his lawyer could only place a hand on his client's shoulder in a silent gesture from someone who knew every legal avenue had been sealed shut by the power of forensics. The sentencing moved to Martin Cole. He stepped up to the stand, face exhausted, shoulders slumped like a man who no longer had the energy to deny anything. Martin's partial cooperation during the investigation was noted by the judge as a mitigating factor. However, the chain of physical evidence placed him squarely at the center of the criminal act. His sweat sample on the pallet bar. His DNA appearing next to Daisy's in the coercion area. The direction of the pulling force matching his body height, and his own statement, admitting he struck Daisy when she refused to sign the fraudulent document. This led the court to conclude that Martin had not merely stood beside Victor but had directly participated in rendering Daisy unable to resist. The judge sentenced Martin to 42 years in prison, a term that reflected both his role in the crime and his cooperation in helping unlock the case. When he heard the number 42, Martin closed his eyes, as though he had just seen the image of container 514 that he had tried to forget for 4 decades. That moment showed he understood the sentence given to him was not just a number of years behind bars, but the final mark of the truth he had run from. The court devoted a portion of the sentencing to clarifying the role of Evan Briggs, even though he had died back in the 1980s. The judge declared that modern forensics had positively identified Briggs as a participant in the initial phase of the coercion. His fingerprints on the container wall, O+ blood on the binding cord, and DNA sequences matching samples collected. Although Briggs was no longer alive to face justice, the official recognition of his role was entered into the record for historical significance, ensuring the case file was closed with complete information about everyone who had contributed to Daisy Moore's death. This provided the necessary closure for Daisy's family, who had lived 40 years with the question of the third perpetrator's identity. When the court stated that Daisy had been killed in an internal conflict within an industrial crime ring, the entire courtroom went still. No one spoke. No one moved. The truth lay there, exposing not only the act of murder but also the criminal context hidden beneath what had seemed like ordinary industrial work. Daisy had not become a victim of a sudden outburst, but of a systematically maintained fraudulent structure. The prosecutor stood up and concluded the hearing with words that the press later described as the moment that choked the entire room. He said, "Daisy had no body to return, but science brought Daisy back. It was science that gave her a voice that had been taken from her for 40 years. Those words were not rhetoric. They were confirmation that forensics from soil profiling, DNA, 3D modeling, to satellite data had become the witness Daisy could no longer be." When the hearing ended and the 2 defendants were led away, many people in the courtroom stayed seated for a long time not to watch them go, but to absorb the feeling of this long-delayed justice. No one knows exactly what Daisy's final moments were like, but they left the courthouse with one certainty. The silence of 40 years had been broken, and the truth had been placed exactly where it belonged under the light of justice. When the federal court issued the sentences for Victor Hale and Martin Cole, one final step remained in the Daisy Moore case, establishing her legal status, after 40 years of leaving no biological trace outside the coercion scene. The Civil Registry Office signed the decision declaring Daisy legally deceased, based on the forensic conclusions and the criminal verdict that clearly outlined the pattern of behavior leading to her death. This decision was not merely procedural. It was a milestone allowing Daisy's family to close a chapter of life suspended between hope and loss. That legal status also served as the basis for completing the case file, shifting it from missing person to resolved homicide. When the decision was signed, the FBI added Daisy Moore's name to the Forensic Reconstruction Milestones list, a group of cases in which science played the pivotal role in reconstructing truths that transcended time and the limits of contemporary technology. The Daisy case was placed alongside historic files that had changed the way federal agencies approach cold cases, thanks to the integration of 1980s satellite data, modern AI, soil profiling, layered DNA, and criminal-grade 3D modeling. This combination created a new standard for post-incident investigation, where technology no longer merely supports but actively leads the pursuit of truth. When the official file was finally closed, it carried a rare conclusion in the world of cold cases. No remaining legal ambiguities. Every action, every participant, every timestamp, every movement path, and every piece of evidence was linked by an unbreakable forensic logic chain. The lead investigator signed the comprehensive report, a document nearly 1,000 pages long that chronicled the entire 4-decade arc of the case. The initial encounter, the 1985 scene analysis errors, Briggs's strange disappearance, the long neglect of Zone C, overlooked evidence, unopened sealed envelopes, the forensic science explosion in the 2010s, the emergence of AI and NASA satellite data, next-generation DNA, and TRA-D reconstruction. The report pinpointed the flawed inferences that caused the case to be closed prematurely while documenting the advances that unlocked the entire evidence system. That document resembled a history of the evolution of American criminal investigation viewed through the lens of a single victim. When the report was released internally, it quickly became a teaching resource for federal cold case training courses. New investigators saw in the Daisy case not just a personal tragedy, but a complete map of what is required to crack a seemingly unsolvable case. Persistence, the ability to re-examine evidence with new technology, the integration of human insight with machine power, and humility in the face of previous generations' mistakes. The Daisy case taught that a cold case is never solely about the moment of the crime. It is a challenge spanning decades, where each new layer of technology can peel back another layer of truth. Ultimately, when the entire process was entered into the legal system, one principle was recorded as an affirmative summary line. Not every cold case requires a body to illuminate the truth. In the Daisy case, there was no grave, no remains, no place to lay flowers. But forensics replaced all of that with indisputable data points. Broken hair, collar fabric fibers, DNA on the binding cord, fingerprints on the metal wall, Zone C soil profiling, 3D model of the pulling force, satellite data recording the small truck's movements, and Martin's collapsing confession. Those elements combined into a legal body, one that lacked physical existence but possessed absolute evidentiary presence. This is why the FBI regards the Daisy case as an academic exemplar. A victim absent from physical reality can still be fully present in the courtroom through science. When the final decision was archived, Daisy Moore's name stood between two timelines: the day she vanished and the day her justice was established. Between those markers lay 40 years of silence, errors, concealment, and ultimately the resurrection of truth. Daisy was filed under case closed, yet no one left the records room with a sense of finality. Her story became a reminder that science is not merely a tool for catching perpetrators. It is a way to restore a voice to those who no longer had the chance to speak in their final moments. In the story of Daisy Moore, what makes Americans today pause and reflect is not only the tragedy that stretched across 4 decades, but the way the truth was ultimately uncovered through the tiniest seeming details: a torn collar thread, a few grains of hydraulic oil-contaminated soil from Zone C, faint fingerprints on the container wall, or a faint heat signature in a 1985 NASA satellite image. All of those things, pieced together by technology and persistence, proved that no matter how long the time span, truth can still return if people never stop searching. This lesson is especially vital in today's American life, where modern speed makes it easy for many to overlook warning signals in work, family, or community. Daisy tried to warn about wrongdoing but was isolated, and the silence around her created the opportunity for the crime to occur. This reminds us that when someone speaks up about something abnormal, fraud, a safety violation, or a community risk, listening and acting early can save a life. The case also demonstrates the value of transparency and information verification. Zone C was forgotten. Sealed envelopes went unopened. Records were incorrectly filed. All consequences of complacency. In today's American environment, from corporate management to public agencies, rechecking data and scrutinizing the dark corners of processes is not just a duty, it is a way to prevent similar tragedies. But the most powerful lesson lies in the prosecutor's final message. Science brought Daisy back. In a country that respects technology and justice like the United States, those words remind us that progress does not serve convenience alone. It is also a tool to protect truth and human dignity. What matters is that we must support investments in forensics, preserve records, promote transparency, and ensure no victim ever disappears into silence, simply because the technology or people of their era were not yet capable of uncovering the truth. If you believe stories like the Daisy Moore case deserve to be told with their full final truth, please hit subscribe to join us on the journey of digging deeper into America's cold cases. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video where justice, science, and the memories of victims will continue to be brought back into the light.